You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
If you've listened to Saving Elephants for any length of time, you know by now I consider myself to be a classical conservative and especially a Burkean conservative after the mold of Edmund Burke. So I would not be doing my due diligence as a podcast host if I went for very long without attempting to explain Edmund Burke's ideas, or at least mildly triggering my Straussian pals, those who are disciples of Leo Strauss, as Strauss's depiction of Edmund Burke in his book Natural Right and History paints Burke in a light that has created a dispute between us Burkeans and the Straussians to this day. So since I take my duty as a Burkean conservative seriously, I was delighted to welcome on the guest in this episode, Dr. Greg Collins, political science professor at Yale University. Now, I am certainly no Yale professor, but Dr. Collins and I do have in common that we are both millennials, and we both fancy ourselves to be Burkeans. He wrote the relatively recent book, Commerce and Manners in Edmund Burke's Political Economy, which we discuss in this conversation, and has published numerous articles on figures such as Smith, Hayek, Frederick Douglass, Vogelin, Strauss, and an essay on how Leo Strauss got Burke wrong in his book, Natural Right and History, which we open the conversation with. But before I turn us over to that conversation, I wanted to mention that I met Dr. Collins in a virtual class. The class produced by the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, or the Kirk Center, and it inaugurates their new program, the School of Conservative Studies. Dr. Gregory Collins, or Greg, was joined by Dr. Ian Crow, and every Tuesday evening in the month of February, they took turns taking large sections of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France and dissecting it piece by piece to see what arguments and ideas we could glean that may be of some importance today. If this conversation is of interest to you, and I will warn you, this conversation tends quite a bit more toward the nerdy side, but I know sometimes listeners, that's exactly what you want. But if this conversation intrigues you, and if the idea of taking a virtual class in the School of Conservative Studies from the Kirk Center intrigues you, I have some more information about it in the show notes. But with that, I give you my conversation with Dr. Greg Collins.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
I have read Leo Strauss's Natural Right and History. Won't claim I understand all of it, but I think I picked up on enough or understand enough to see that he is, while not necessarily anti-Burke, is certainly suggesting that Edmund Burke's thoughts led to, and I can't necessarily tell if he meant intentionally or probably inadvertently, historicism, right? The rise of the political ideology. So I'm wondering if we can start here with, because I imagine at this point there's a number of listeners saying, what are you even talking about, Josh? So can we start with kind of answering two questions? First of all, what is historicism, the sort of Burke, the sort of boogeyman for the Straussian? And what is Leo Strauss's basic argument as to what is it about Burke that puts us in danger of this historicism path?
Yes, no, I started to read. Thank you for the question. I believe I read Natural Right and History in high school, and I didn't understand almost all of it.
Oh, bless your heart.
Yeah, I was floating around in my father's bookshelf, and I've reread it since then, and I still only understand. I'm still trying to deepen my my understanding of that book. But yes, for Strauss, historicism is, put simply, the reduction of moral standards to history, historical development, historical circumstance, historical context. So that's why those words, context, circumstance, history, empiricism, organic growth, development, evolution, those for Strauss and the Straussian perspective are trigger words that suggest the absence of any universal moral standards, whether it's regarding practical morality or the timeless pursuit of truth. Now, Burke uses similar language in Reflections on the Revolution in France, his famous tract criticizing the French Revolution, and his other writings and speeches. So the suggestion is from Strauss in Natural Right and History is that Burke's thought, although he himself does not explicitly argue that morals can be reduced to history, historical circumstance, the argument was that, as you suggested, Burke helped pave the way for the rise of historicism, which really became fueled by Hegel and then continued on in the 20th century with Heidegger. I wrote that article because I believe that this was unfair characterization of Burke's thought. It was inaccurate in my judgment, and I felt there was a need to further address this question. There were one or two articles that addressed it previously, but the point here was to argue that one, Strauss' interpretation, it's plucked out of context, if I may use that phrase in this conversation, in which he cites Burke suggesting that the French Revolution may be part of sort of the whims of history, and that at some point man may have to just defer to the whims of history. He takes this quotation out of context, and if you map this interpretation onto the broad corpus of his beliefs, I think is a gross mischaracterization and misinterpretation. One, first and foremost, because Burke, of course, it would be difficult to understand Burke's political thought, his statesmanship, without being motivated by some underlying principle. Otherwise, he would not have frequently taken firm political and moral stances on issues that actually defied deferring to the whims of history, whether it was the French Revolution or lesser-known episodes throughout his life. So practically speaking, it doesn't pass the sniff test. Second, if you do probe Burke's writings and speeches, there is an underlying moral argument that he is making. Now, one legitimate criticism of Burke is that because he did not write his treatise, most of the time he did not write his systematic treatises. So it is difficult to glean at times what his underlying moral animating principles are. And even in the reflections on the Revolution in France, sometimes it's difficult to do so. And the reader is left wanting more. Okay, what is Burke's 10-point plan? And of course that's one of his points in his political philosophy is that life can't be reduced to 10-point plans. But still, as a reader, you want a little. At times you want a little more. But basically, I would describe his moral thought as some sort of underlying moral natural law. Natural law is a fraught concept, but for him, he liked to use the phrase moral law, moral compact, moral contract to suggest this underlying a moral human ground that connected peoples from throughout the world, which is why in his speeches on the impeachment proceedings of Warren Hastings, he's trying to invoke this language both for rhetorical purposes and also moral purposes to show that there's some underlying common strand that connects the people in the East and to the people in the West. And then also, his moral law included principally a hierarchy of moral law, starting at the top with God, a source of transcendence, and then working one's way down to the mundane, temporal, secular, earthly, human level. And this is evident in his famous comments on how life is not simply a voluntary contract, but a moral compact. And then elsewhere, you see language connecting higher orders with lower orders. So Burke is making the argument that there is a sort of a sense of moral transcendence that encompasses all human beings, and yet we are in a sort of a hierarchically ordered whole, which is not, I would say, it's not even unlike Thomas Aquinas and his conception of different types of law, even though Burke sort of shied away from medieval scholasticism, and even though I don't think his thought was synonymous with that way of thought. But nevertheless, there is this explicit moral hierarchy in Burke's thought that again cannot be reduced to simple historicism.
There's obviously a lot here, and I want to start picking apart some of your response because I think it's obvious, it's complicated, right? Strauss is hard to understand. Burke is hard to understand, and when you got both of them together, that can get even more challenging. And I would say maybe as a front end, when I asked you to introduce the term historicism, I share, I guess, the Straussians' concerns with the historicism school of thought, and it sounds like oftentimes, or at least if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not coming from the angle of no, historicism's cool and it's okay if Burke took us that way. You're objecting to the entire notion that Burke is quasi-responsible for leading us down this path.
Yes, if one plucks quotations out of context, and to your point, both Strauss is difficult to understand and Burke is difficult to understand. I'm still trying to understand Burke after many years of reading him and trying to understand him. If you pluck particular quotations out of context, you could write an article or book defending the belief that Burke is emphasizing history so much, circumstance so much, expediency, and so on. Therefore, this provides a defense of history shorn from any broader metaphysical moral foundations. And a lot of those quotations do come out of reflections on the Revolution of France. But I just suggest for those listeners, read and reread the reflections and try to discern. The interpretation that Burke is providing, in my judgment, is not a reflexive defense of history and tradition. And in fact, in many ways, Burke is making the argument in favor of progress as long as enduring moral, social, religious foundations are preserved. And for him, you can't have any progress, you can't have any reform, modification, improvement unless you preserve those enduring foundations. Otherwise, then it does truly become difference of history, in which the whims of the moments, the passions of the moments, the contractual arrangements of the moment breed no enduring standard that can withstand those temporary arrangements. And then also in his other works, right, he'll evoke natural rights language here and there, and Straussians like to use that language as well. And so the other quotation you can use actually to push back against the historicist interpretation of Burke. For me, even if you take Burke's arguments of good faith, when he does emphasize in history and circumstance, which I think are certainly accurate representations of his thought, but a proper understanding of those terms in his writings is not an indication of reduction of moral standards to history. And in fact, I mean, because a lot of the Straussians are also defenders of the Western civilizational order and the American constitutional order. And I tease out some of these similarities in that article you mentioned. There's substantive overlap between Burke's defense of an entailed inheritance, in his case, entailed inheritance of European civilization and British civilization as well. It's very analogous to Straussian's interpretation of Western civilization, including the American constitutional project, in terms of reflecting the best of a tradition, the embodied wisdom of the great thinkers and ideas in books and texts of the past, and using that not simply as a perfect method to understand the present, but using it as a presumptive foundation, presumptive wisdom, in order to inform our understanding of contemporary circumstances. This is not to mention the fact that, of course, Strauss emphasized the importance of prudence in the legislator. For Burke, prudence was the first of all virtues.
The god of this lower world, I believe.
God's lower world, and one difference I mentioned in the article, there's a Straussian impulse to try to understand the origins of society based on the original lawmaker or legislator, right, inspired by classical antiquity like Ferguson and so on. For Burke, there is not that present in his thought, and so I think that is a clear tension. For Burke, a community is not started by a single lawgiver with special powers to design society in accord with some moral standard. That's not to say the political community can't can try to conform itself to the moral standard. It's just that moral standard was not in the political manifestations to try to bring about that moral standard was not the product of a single sole lawmaker, which does then also affirm his defense of the inherited wisdom of the past.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, because I'm not a believer that the Burkean and the Straussian are in agreement on all points. It's just this is a particular point that's kind of stuck in the craw of the Burkeans for a long time that we feel like, whoa, you guys got us wrong. Now, that being said, I want to give Straussians their due, because there are multiple fans of Edmund Burke, and a lot of their names are escaping me now. Woodrow Wilson might be a good example, who interpret Burke in a way that may fit Strauss's critique here. And I think the historian Peter Stanlis, if I'm not mistaken, kind of really took this to task. Those who I think he used the term the utilitarian approach to Burke, right? That all Burke is concerned about is just the procedure, the utility of something. Does it work? There is no higher moral principle behind it. And so I want to acknowledge that it was not just Leo Strauss that had this thought in mind. And I guess I'm saying that in a way of sort of asking this question. If Edmund Burke were able to look through time and see people like us having this conversation, do you think he would have penned a treatise or some sort of whoa, wait a minute. I'm not trying to confuse anybody. I just happen to be a politician. I was a statesman. And so, of course, I was only talking about concrete, specific instances. But no, I absolutely... Could he have just cleared this up for everybody and it was just a matter of he had no way of knowing we would debate this? Or do you think he intended for it to be kind of this difficult to pin him down on?
Yeah, I'm hoping, in some archive in Britain, there is a dusty manuscript, unpublished manuscript, 500-page manuscript of Burke's, outlining his principles.
We'll settle this for once and all.
Right. His, his version of Aristotle's Politics, or, Locke's second treatise, two treatises, and so on. I don't know if that's out there. If you're around today, I could see him not opposing that sort of project, but not even like. I think also I'm increasingly of the mind that Burke and Aristotle are more similar than people give them credit for, and of course Strauss likes Aristotle. He would pen a treatise, first starting with drawing out, the empirical historical circumstances that reflect his broader, more general principles. And these general principles for Burke, and this is why the utilitarian moniker it can be a little confusing. For Burke, utility beyond rights, beyond more abstract language such as equality and so on, utility should be the standard. But for him, the utility was not mathematical calculating utility. In fact, he criticizes this mindset in Reflection on the Revolution in France. For him, utility simply meant general notions of the common good, of human flourishing. If people seem to be happy, if things seem to be working, if people are prosperous both materially and spiritually, diagnose why, make a good faith judgment about why that is the case, such as whether it derives from English common law or due process rights or the establishment of organized religion. Make some judgment about what of these conditions, when put together, do promote some sort of, to use Aristotle's language, conception of human flourishing. That therefore, utility understood in that capacious sense, absolutely, Burke was right there. But this is different from the later iterations of 19th century utilitarianism and certainly 20th century forms of utilitarianism, including the more destructive forms of utilitarianism. And then also I should add, I'm sorry, to your early point, it wasn't just Strauss. Woodrow Wilson, 19th century British utilitarians also pushed forth this interpretation, including Burke biographers as well. And even that phrase utilitarianism in the 19th century can mean various different things. But Burke's point is that it's, in my reading, judging the merits of a society shouldn't be determined by the scope of individual autonomy or rights or abstract conceptions that are difficult to apply in reality. It should be a judgment on whether a person is being as fully formed as possible in a locality, in a neighborhood, as part of a broader nation. And admittedly, this is still not sufficiently precise, even in my own judgment. But for him, This is different from your later forms of utilitarianism, and certainly different from sort of abstract natural rights claims of the French Revolution. This is why I think for Burke and Aristotle, Aristotle, human flourishing, daimonia, Burke is closer to that way of thinking about things than the alternatives that I just outlined. Even though some people say that Burke's, he doesn't really have a teleological end to his political thought, unlike Aristotle. I suggest that he does. In fact, this teleological end is some general sense of human happiness within this broader, in the broader sphere of the divine and the transcendent. Again, not fully satisfying, but that's my judgment. That's my interpretation of Burke that can protect himself against the utilitarian charge. Even though, again, he was certainly aware of more practical utilitarian benefits of society. And that's why also, sometimes he's interpreted as a statesman, a lawgiver, unhinged from any moral principle. For him, the principle was expediency or utility and so on. Sort of narrowly understood those words, utility and expediency. I don't think that captures Burke's thoughts at all. I mean, if he really were pursuing expedient ends, that he would not, again, have consistently gone against his opposition, split the Whig Party, taking firm political moral stances that threatened his personal professional lives.
Right. You had mentioned earlier, just kind of in passing, almost the trial of Hastings, and I think one of the most common critiques, in fact, a friend of mine, Cal Davenport, has been on the podcast a time or two, says he really needs to come up with a better retort to the Straussians than "you're reading Burke wrong," or "you need to read more Burke than just the reflections to get a broader sense of, well, no, in this case, he clearly laid out these principles over here violating, the individual rights." But I wanted to ask you, because this whole series of questions I'm asking, of course, is not new, and you're not the first scholar to come along and take the position that Strauss misinterpreted some part of Burke. So I'm curious, because I'm not part of the intellectual milieu, if you will. When you encounter a Straussian, are they likely to say, "Yeah, you make a good point," or do they still contend that no, we think that the natural right and history interpretation of Burke is actually the better view?
Yes, yeah, I'm friends with Straussians. I've read a good amount of Strauss books, and I was trained.
I am too, by the way. I deeply respect that school of thought. I just think on this particular issue, they're a little off.
My favorite course undergrad was a couple of favorite professors, political theory professors, but one of my favorite was Professor Hadliarkis, and his course, I believe, is called Political Obligations at Amherst College. I went to UMass Amherst. There's a great political theory professor there as well, Roberto Alejandro. But Professor Arkes, it was a great course on political obligations. Read statesmen, the Lincolns of the world. We read some philosophy as well. so I'm certainly indebted to the tradition. Yeah, when I talk to, oh gosh, I'm trying to think the typical reaction. One, like all these conversations, the most radical critics tend to get the most airtime. But of course, Professor Harvey Mansfield, Stephen Lensner, who wrote the first prominent article on Burke and Strauss, some others are more sympathetic to Burke's arguments. So there is certainly some gray area in this debate.
It's
But
probably fair to say that it would not be fair to say Straussians agree on all points. They fight a lot within their ranks.
no, yeah, absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. And not just not only between West Coast, East Coast, but within East Coast, West Coast.
Right.
And it's one of these, you can 2 to 3 degrees of separation. You can bring in a lot of these, classical liberal conservative political theory circles. At some point, the fine distinctions do break down. But the exchange will typically lead back to the dispute over natural rights, ultimately natural rights. Natural rights, rights by nature. If they're rights by nature, they're not rights by convention. They're not rights by history, and so on. Rights can't. The moral foundation of rights can't evolve throughout history. Right? They have to be established. Hence, the need for a lawgiver and legislator. And so that ultimately, for me, that's the nub, the crux of the dispute. Even though
let me, because I think you're probably anticipating where I'm wanting to go with all this, and I asked this just about of anybody that studied Burke. Can you help explain for us, what did Edmund Burke think about natural rights? Do they exist? Don't they? If they do exist, what is the limitation of us humans of imposing them? I mean, he has some interesting ththings to say about it, and I can certainly understand somebody saying he just denies their existence. But what, in your view, was Burke's actual views of natural rights?
Yes, yeah. I think we mentioned this to your question in the Kirk seminar. He appealed to natural rights. He invoked natural rights here and there. But for him, if you actually take a look at our concrete circumstances, we live in circumstances, even if we are happy, we can be happy and flourishing in concrete circumstances, even if they don't fully realize natural rights. If you are embedded in a family, a community, a locality, a church, a synagogue, a city, a nation, and so on, all of these in some way are violations on our natural rights.
Because they're imposing some sort of duty upon our liberty, presumably.
Imposing duties on liberties, imposing rituals and customs, moral expectations on our liberties. Now, the response to that is, okay, that's not irreconcilable with natural rights. You have to have the natural right to voluntarily choose to perform this duty. And it's only one line of reasoning. But then, a Burkean response would be something like, okay, that's true, but some duties should not be voluntary, and they do not derive from, and hence they do not derive from rights, but some sort of higher moral power. Which is why it's interesting. The invocation of natural rights, that itself can lead to more relativism, because there's no inherent attachment to duties. It would have to be something, natural rights and duties. And then even for Burke, the nature itself, and this is another key criticism from the Straussian perspective. For nature and custom do merge, and if we have natural rights, we have these natural rights that are not, then from Burkean perspective, cannot be separated from our rights in these customary institutions. And those customary institutions, to your point, impose pre-existing obligations and duties on us. And we can connect it back to my earlier comments on his conception of moral philosophy, in which, depending on the station we're in life, that itself demands the fulfillment of these responsibilities that are not the product of our choice, that are not the product of our rights. And yes, so that's why for Burke, so back to your original point, for natural rights, even if they do exist, they don't come close to capturing the moral, social, religious, political texture of concrete human beings in a concrete community. You could argue that natural rights, right? If you live in a family that violates your natural rights, you could argue that if you live in a community that violates your natural rights, and so on, up to the nation. Which is also very interesting. The Straussian embrace of the nation. If you embrace the nation ostensibly, right, their attachments and fidelity, loyalty to a nation. But if you attach yourself to something, then that itself inherently infringes on your natural rights in some way, because again, that's an allegiance beyond the realization of someone's rights. So this is the nub of his problem in the reflection on the Revolution of France. In his judgment, you have the revolutionaries asserting natural rights to this and that and so on. This dissolves these pre-existing moral duties and religious social affiliations and customs. That for him, we're not certainly perfect. We're not utopian, but they preserve this presumptive wisdom and foundation to build on, as opposed to completely tear down.
So going off what you've said there, because this, and I recognize Burke's ideas exist with intention. There's a lot of, I mentioned Woodrow Wilson. There's a lot of people that get them wrong one way. A lot of people get them wrong the other way. Heck, maybe I get them totally wrong one way and I'm just not seeing it at the moment. But, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because we haven't brought this up yet, but based on what you had just said, you could just pluck that out and say, okay, this sounds also like a defense of Burke as understood by, say, like Patrick Deneen, and the illiberal crowd that would say, liberalism contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. And here, to be clear, I'm not talking about leftism. I mean classical liberalism, the idea of our natural rights, that it contains within it the seeds of its own destruction because it's pulling them away from our duties, which Burke recognizes. In fact, Deneen, in his book, quotes Burke frequently. He anchors, it would seem, his ideas within what he perceives to be a Burkean framework, because Burke is saying, no, you've got to wed these things to your duties, and when you do so, you've almost undermined or questioned the entire classical liberal project. Now, I say that, I've also heard others argue that Edmund Burke is in some sense the father of classical liberalism. So can you help untangle that? How would Burke fit into a classical liberal tradition? Is he opposed to it? Is he for it? Where does he fit?
Yes, yeah, no, I saw you had Dan Klein on earlier, and Dan and I have gone back and forth on this. And also, it's interesting that Deneen quotes Burke favorably. Some of the Straussians will criticize Burke, but the Straussians and Deneen also have overlapping diagnoses of the limits of modern liberalism. So for Burke and classical liberalism, there's certainly an influential strain of interpreters of Burke that do characterize him as a liberal, not a modern progressive, but a classical liberal. I certainly understand that reasoning. The argument that Burke, he was a modernizing liberal progressive Whig and so on. Then the French Revolution comes, and that's a little too radical for his thought. I still think Burke was a conservative while embracing some liberal elements, because for him, what was essential for him is that using these terms anachronistically, but you need to have that enduring foundation in order to embrace liberalizing elements in a polity. You can't have the reverse is more dangerous. A liberalizing foundation with conservative elements. That is, let's say, religion. For him, organized religion, you need to have organized religion firmly planted in a community. And then that provides a stability in order to allow for more free thinkers and liberal dissenters and so on, as opposed to the reverse, which is why he also says, I think, this is quoting Bolingbroke, that it's easier to graft a republic onto a monarchy than the reverse. I assume similar reasoning that he think a monarchy provides some sort of foundation, and then you can sort of liberalize as long as as long as that foundation is preserved. So in this sense, if one characterizes Burke as a classical liberal, I won't lose sleep over it, but especially sort of the Dan Klein infused, Adam Smithian infused empirical classical liberalism, not necessarily the Lockean classical liberalism, because there are sharper tensions between that Lockean view and Burke, and hence there's sharper tensions between the Lockean view as interpreted by Deneen and Burke. But if you embrace sort of a Humean, because Hume is also characterized both as a classical liberal and a conservative, the Humean Smithian, let's say classical liberalism, that is closer to Burke, and there were differences between Burke and the Hume Smith crowd.
And by the way, and if I understand Dan Klein correctly, he does often he David Hume's, Adam Smith, and Edmund Burke, he equates those ideas, those thinkers together as having a very clear underlying moral, I don't know what you call that, kind of thinking or foundation or philosophy.
Yeah. Here's my challenge to all the listeners here who are characterized Burke as a liberal, who want to characterize all these thinkers as a classical liberal. I'm friends with you. I fully understand this perspective, but try out Burke the conservative, or conservatism just for a day, and see how it is. And I think you'll find that you'll be comfortable with a lot of this framework, and perhaps over time understand that there is a sharper, more pronounced emphasis on these enduring foundations that can withstand the fluxes from generation to generation, and that go beyond the quite important imperatives of voluntary contracts and individual rights and so on. that material is certainly in Burke and the Burkean, in Burkean conservatism. But the benefit of him, he goes beyond that, and Smith and Hume do to some extent as well. I just don't think it's as present or it's as sufficiently argued and defended as Burke. And in fact, I'm drafting an article right now on how Adam Smith, he himself, has sometimes been appropriated to defend more of the sort of a classical liberalism that overlooks some of these elements in his thought that do defend social orders and hierarchies, that do defend these local attachments, very Burkean ideas. And to be fair to Smith, he's providing this material in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is published 1759, so years before Burke became prominent on the scene. But the point being is that in these thinkers' thought, in his contemporary thoughts, there are these ideas associated with Burke, Burkean ideas, that do illuminate these distinctive qualities of today what we consider to be conservatism, such as these pre-rational cognitive prejudices and affections, and that can't be reduced to scientific calculation or technocratic administrative technocracy that Burke is most closely affiliated with. And so Burke and classical liberal tradition, I certainly understand that, but I do think ultimately that it's more accurate to place him as a conservative with sort of a liberal, with liberal open for liberal reform, as opposed to the opposite.
So, and so just so I'm understanding you correctly, because if you phrase it that way, I'd assume I know the answer here, but you're not going to lose sleep if somebody says, well, Burke's defending classical liberalism, but that's not necessarily the view you hold. But if you reverse that, is a faithful reading of Burke going to lead us to a Patrick Deneen illiberalism?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So a Burkean conservatism does incorporate liberal elements. If defined, however, as Deneen defines liberalism as the constant maximization of individual autonomy, right, ever expanding scope of rights and liberties, divorced from your attachments to the community and so on. Under that definition of liberalism, no, Burke is, there are heavy tensions between that characterization of liberalism and Burke's brand of conservatism. But so if you adopt a different definition of liberalism, more in the Smithian Humean light, and you get, certainly bring in Hayek as well, that is then closer to, even though I think it doesn't get to Burke, that's closer to Burke and far more persuasive and tenable than that the Dean's characterization of liberalism. Because that characterization of liberalism, that's now veering more towards Locke and Rousseauian territory. And even Locke, I teach Locke every semester. There have been so many bad political ideas put forth in the intellectual political atmosphere throughout the centuries. Locke is not at the top. There's so many more dangerous culprits. Now, for me, Locke, Locke is not fully persuasive in the state of nature, such, and emphasizes rights over duties and so on, and which is also Deneenite critiques. But in the grand scope of things, individual rights, rule of law, that stuff is there in Locke. That stuff is there in Burke. Even if they do hold, otherwise they hold tensions on, state of nature doctrine or natural rights arguments as well. So that's my argument. Yeah, if defined as liberal, as Deneen defines as liberalism, then Burke would be in opposition to that framework. But again, the more empirically oriented classical liberalism, the Smith Hume, bringing Hayek in that conversation as well, then he's closer to that circle.
I've always kind of just had the sense that of the big three social contract theorists, right? John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I was going to say Hume. That's not right. Hobbes. There we go. That Locke's is the most comfortable version, at least I have, of any of those interpretations. Even if social contract theory is not the correct way to think of how we develop political theory, I think that it's it. I understand what you're saying. It would seem that a world that tried to impose Locke's ideas is going to go off the rails a lot slower than one that took Hobbes or Rousseau serious.
Yeah, no, I mean Rousseau especially. Even though, there's some arguments of Rousseau and Burke. They were aware of the rationalizing pretensions of their age, and those arguments, at some point, they break down because of Rousseau's, rejection of original sin and especially for Burke, even before. It's also interesting the historiography of Rousseau. At the start of the French Revolution, it was not Rousseau's social contract. It was not his political thought, but more his aesthetics, his vanity, his thoughts on vanity that had gained prominence in Europe. And for Burke, that itself, foremost, even before you get to the political ideas, was absolutely destructive to social order, which is why in the reflections, discussing the Kirk seminar, it's not just a defense of political thought or defense of religion, defense of tradition, and so on. It's an aesthetic argument, an aesthetic argument about the moral imagination. This also relates back to our conversation about his moral philosophy. If you strip human beings down to our most naked, shivering, savage selves, that is going to remove what he calls the decent drapery of life that elevates and dignifies and ennobles us as concrete beings in concrete circumstances with concrete roles and responsibilities and duties, whether we are either in a family or in a community, in a business, in a religious institution. And when we look at a human being, we don't see a naked, shivering person. Hopefully, we don't. But we see a person with embedded in some relationship, whether it's simply between a conversation between you and that person, but that person signifies, represents some qualities, some characteristics that we can intuit based on the exercise of our moral imagination. That again can't be reduced to simply natural rights arguments. And for Burke, also this I think is where he gets it's an additional dimension to his thought that some of the other classical liberals don't sufficiently emphasize. Which also I'm appealing to classical liberals listening to this. Give more additional thought to Burke's idea of this moral imagination and his beliefs about how we're not simply individuals, but we're individuals with meaning and purpose because of the institutions, affiliations, loyalties that we do hold, and that is what gives us a broader sense of the transcendent, rather than simply maximizing our individual rights or individual autonomy. I forget the source, the original point of this question. What was it?
Well, that's fine. It's actually you're saying that made me. I wanted to ask you because I've wondered this for a while. I kind of get the sense in reading early Burke that his reviews, say, of Rousseau's writings, seem to be somewhat a mixed bag. There was criticism there, of course, but then there was some praise of some other matters. But then when you get to some of his very last writings, if I've got this right, the Letter of a Regicide Peace, or it's just post-reflections writings. I mean, he's depicting Rousseau as spawn of Satan. So did Burke's view of Rousseau change, or was it a matter of France taking serious Rousseau's moral imagination, if you will, and that's what he's rejecting too?
That's a great topic. As far as I know, off the top of my head, I don't remember coming across an article tracing the reception of Rousseau and Burke's thought from his early years to his latter years. That's great. Maybe that's for my next article. But I would say, it's one of those things. I would say he was always suspicious of Rousseau, right? He had a mixed bag of his early reviews, and then when the French Revolution comes along, especially when the French Revolution started, right then to erect a statue in favor of Rousseau and naming streets after Rousseau, and then Robespierre invoking Rousseau and so on. That's when, and this is after Rousseau publishes his Juliet, pardon my French, and when his ideas on vanity really began to gain circulation in a way that for Burke detected that this was the poison that would corrupt the manners and morals of European civilization. Oh, that's the other point. Yeah, for Burke, when we read the reflections, it's not only a political argument, but when he says, there's a revolution in manners. For him, revolution in manners, even more so than any disruption of political institution. That for him was the death knell of Europe.
That is, by the way, exactly where I wanted to go next, because you, of course, have written the book, Commerce and Manners in Edmund Burke's Political Economy. And I guess I wanted to start here because I can understand the way these words are used these days. If a person is talking about Burke was mostly concerned about manners, I can understand a person being like, well, this sounds like an old fogey. Why is he concerned about being polite, and did you hold the door open for the lady as she's walking by when the world's on fire? So how is, first of all, what is Burke's understanding of manners? And second, why are they so important to him?
Yes, yeah. So the characterization of Burke, as you suggested, is of oftentimes, of the defender of traditional manners, chivalry, holding the door open, and so on, a defender of the stuffy aristocrat, sort of removed from the beating pulse of politics. And this is, I think, an oversimplification of Burke not because he didn't embrace those ideas, but because he was a heated political participant and oftentimes criticized the aristocracy for not living up to the aristocracy's responsibilities as an aristocracy, as a nobility. With heightened power comes heightened privileges. And so if you have heightened power and you don't with heightened power and privileges come heightened responsibilities. And so if you don't fulfill those responsibilities, then you are liable, then you should receive criticism. And so for Burke, manners, even more so than, prescribed morals, let's say in statutes or in written laws, it's these manners that condition us to be civilized and to allow us to preserve our civilizing relations with others from different walks in life, whether it's between men and women, poor and rich, old and young, infirm and healthy, Englishmen, Frenchmen, and so on. These are what allow us to cultivate our attachments and affections that aren't dependent ultimately on statutory law or even the specific political arrangement in power. Which is why for Burke, he's considered to be a defender of the monarchy, but for him, he didn't hold the universal principle in favor of monarchy. It was more, depending on the circumstance of the people, the government should be fitted to those circumstances. And which goes back to the point about his moral thought. For him, the moral thought isn't determined by the particular political arrangement, whether it's monarchy, republic, and so on. But the form of government has to be conducive to promoting the happiness, the flourishing of the people. That for him was the ultimate moral standard beyond the political arrangement. And so for Burke and the Reflections, his view, the French revolutionaries were destroying this idea of manners that condition us to be civil and to appreciate each other as noble, dignified human beings, because in his view, they were stripping down all of individuals to their naked, shivering selves. And therefore, everyone was equal as a faceless, as part of a faceless individual, as part of a homogeneous mass. And yet manners allow us to give a color and flavor to life. So, for instance, holding the door open for someone, giving up your seat for someone, addressing people by Mr. and Mrs. All these, even though sometimes, admittedly, for Burke, some of his thoughts are, from an American perspective, the titles of nobility and the monarchy, that material sometimes is a little uncomfortable to defend.
Right.
As an American, I certainly won't be advocating for monarchy anytime soon, because we have shown that we can establish some sort of Republican form of government that can endure from generation to generation. But even under these various forms of government, you can still preserve this code of manners that ideally should not need to be prescribed into an explicit law, and yet are absolutely essential, or more essential than written laws, concrete political institutions, to again build up civilization. And so manners include morals, but different manners may be evident in different parts of the world, depending on the particular customs and rituals of those cultures. And for Burke, this is what gives us the decent drapery of life, and cannot be reduced to questions of utility, rights, and even abstract conceptions of equality, and so on. Now, in terms of the specific argument, in terms of my book, Commerce and Manners, for him, this goes back to my earlier remarks. The rise of commercial society, and this I get from the great intellectual historian J.J. Pocock. The argument that for Burke, there's a pre-existing code of manners, morals, a religious, social foundation in order to allow commercial society to emerge over time. He was quite aware that commercial society could generate commercial virtues such as diligence and industry and sobriety and punctuality. But for him, these virtues weren't sufficient, and the rise of these virtues emerged in a commercial society that itself was a product of a pre-existing civilization. And you can't preserve the rise of commercial society, a rising liberalizing ethos, without that pre-existing foundation, which principally was shaped by manners, as you said, the spirit of the gentleman and the spirit of religion.
That is, of course, a very familiar old conservative argument, right? That not made by far more than just Burke, that are a defense of the what is the Irving Kristol 2 cheers for capitalism? It is the maximum expression of the individual's freedom, and that it does offer oftentimes the maximum amount of prosperity, but it can't create the very virtues it depends upon for its existence. Even though you're right. It does create certain virtues in a capitalistic society. And so I want to press you a little bit more on this manners point, though, because I think most individuals would understand, well, yeah, you can't have absolute debauchery and expect things to work. But what is the connective tissue? Because the French Revolutionary, the Jacobin, could turn around and say, well, yeah, that's fine and all, but Burke's just defending an oppressive monarchy. We're actually liberating people. We're not saying they should be out in the street, pillaging, raping, murdering. We're just saying the system of government we have does not allow an individual to choose the duties that have been assigned to them. I'm not talking about the family they're born into, but the king can take their property if he wants, or he can do all sorts of things if he wants. So, how would the Burkean approach press back against that? That actually these manners are necessary for your society to not slide into a debauchery situation.
I think Burke in the Reflections does not do a good job of identifying what grievances of the revolutionaries, the commoners, or the intellectual class, were legitimate or more legitimate than other grievances as well. And the reader is wanting more of that commentary in the Reflections. He admitted even decades prior he was aware of the flaws and imperfections of the ancien regime in France. So, and yet, even if we're looking for his 10-point plan on moral political philosophy, maybe a 10-point plan at least on reform, because in other areas of his life, he was a firm proponent of reform. And to your question about whether, existing monarchy or other institutions are oppressive, in his experience as a British legislator, I think if he thought those grievances were legitimate, he'd be the first one to offer prescriptions of reforms to try to reduce, if not eliminate, those oppressive influences of the institution, which is what he did in various other respects, including his economical reform, which he eliminated a lot of offices of the British, of the royal household, whether it's reform of the slave trade, whether it's reform of commercial policy, and so on. So he was a reform-minded legislator. So if he found some common ground with those revolutionaries' grievances of the ancien regime's institutions, I think he'd be fully on board. But he doesn't really. You want more on that in the Reflections.
Right. What you get instead is almost a godlike defense of Marie Antoinette, and it's the reverse of that.
Yeah, but even Marie Antoinette, he was intentional about that.
Right.
That for him reflected the corruption of manners and the destruction of the moral spirit in France. Now, if you reduce the queen to simply a woman, a king to simply a man, that's just going to topple the dominoes, and you're going to reduce all individuals in France to simply individuals, and not people attached to particular provinces and regions and institutions and customs. And so that would be his other retort, I suspect. Make sure you are aware of. Make sure you are accurate in arguing that particular institutions or rituals are oppressive. The fact that they restrict one's liberties does not necessarily mean they are oppressive. The fact that, let's say, as a parent two young girls, we're expecting a third in July, they infringe on my natural rights, my individual autonomy in so many ways. That doesn't necessarily mean that, unlike some of Burke's targets, like Rousseau, I should certainly abandon my children. And so these attachments, they can infringe on our rights. But is that oppression? No, right? But then you go further. Okay, that may not be oppression, but if the king seizes private property, then yes, that's oppression. Which is why for Burke, private property was absolutely essential to be protected from either the king or from other revolutionaries. And this would probably illuminate his additional response. Okay, if private property is being seized by an absolute monarch, then absolutely try to rein in the monarch, which is why he defends the glorious revolution, the parliamentary supremacy, and the parliamentary settlement to try to preserve property rights and due process in the common law system. But then also, make sure the change is going to be better than the existing way of doing things. And so for him, French Revolution was a classic example in which property rights were abused, seized, expropriated, and created more negative consequences than the existing arrangement of property in France at that time. So for him, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that's sort of a way of thinking about things that informed his conception of reform, to allow to preserve the best elements of some society or institutional arrangement while trying to mitigate or eliminate its worst effects while not creating additional social disorder. And that's another a common Burkean application that I think is absolutely applicable today.
So I've observed that a lot of people, in my view, can faithfully interpret Burke and yet arrive at slightly different interpretations of exactly when do we throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? When is revolution necessary over reform? And I, in the reflections, for instance, Burke points to, look, if you Frenchmen had a problem with the Ancien regime, I understand if you found no fine examples there, but certainly somewhere in your past you could have attached something to it and built from that. Whereas the Jacobins were like, no, the regime is the problem. It's not that there, maybe there were some good moral people in the past, but it's the entire institution that needs to come down. And I don't think one would have to tax the imagination too much. Hopefully I'm not committing a category error here, but you can think of, like, for instance, in the United States, the institution of slavery is not one that we ought to just figure out in our past, how do we reform this, say. It's the institution itself is a problem. And I understand that Burke doesn't ever have a 10-point plan, but he does seem to clearly have this notion that true oppression, true arbitrary, absolute power orchestrated against the people can at times necessitate a dare I say, revolutionary response if things are so far gone that reform could never actually set things right. Do I have that right? And if so, where would your parameters be between what sort of things would we look for to say, okay, we've officially crossed the line to where now it's time for the pitchforks and torches. We can't just reform the system.
Yes, and so for Burke, right, there is no line, right? You can't draw a line,
Sure.
and for him, revolution ultimately is not a matter of choice, but a matter of necessity. If you start a revolution, that's not the policy, that's not the product of rational deliberation. But if you don't start the revolution, then your livelihoods are you're going to be extinct. And so for him, this is why this also differs from Locke. Locke says you start a revolution after long train of usurpation, and then you start the act of rebellion. Burke would certainly be on board with the idea that human beings they shouldn't start a revolution at the first whiff of injustice.
Well, maybe to get our parameters here, that's Locke. But on the other end, Hobbes, you never start the revolution.
You never start. Which is why even Hobbes sometimes is, you could make an argument, Hobbes is closer to Burke in some sense about his emphasis on law and order and so deep suspicion of any possibility of disrupting the existing social order. Even though for Hobbes the social order was after the social contract theory and so on. But for Burke, there's no explicit line of demarcation. Because if there is, then he is quite aware that itself, establishing that line, could foment additional socially disruptive effects, if not rebellion, once any political community crossed that line. And because political communities are so different, that line, if you establish a universal standard, for some people, for some communities, that line, crossing that line would not be sufficient to start a rebellion. In other communities, it would be the line sufficient to start a rebellion. So he's cautious about imposing that line. But for him, at some point, right, if all other options have been exhausted, then you're in a state in which you're not going to choose a revolution, but the revolution is going to choose you. I mean, you have to force to resist at some point. And resistance for Burke, critiquing, criticizing, rebuking the status quo, he frequently did, whether it was the British monarchy or, as you mentioned, the slave trade and so on. But his conception of reform was very keen on ensuring that any possible proposed solution would actually be better over the long term than the existing status quo, such as in the slave trade reform. He initially argued for gradual reform with the ultimate aim of eliminating the slavery and the slave trade. Then he briefly supported immediate abolition, late 1780s. Then he reverted back to the gradual reform approach in light of the Haitian rebellion. And so for him, the slave trade, in order to put it in to stamp it out for perpetuity, it required, in his judgment, gradual reform to increasingly give slaves more and more rights. Not unlike inspired by other slave codes in the West Indies. Give slaves more and more rights, allow them to purchase their freedom, allow them to maintain their families, allow them to acquire more and more property. And this was part of his broader plan of slave trade reform that would eventually, in his view, both eradicate slavery and the slave trade. But But in terms of revolution, I mean, also it depends on the type of resistance. The American Revolution, we call it the American Revolution, but the Burkean perspective would suggest it's not a revolution; it was a restoration, right? And so the revolution actually did not occur; it was prevented because property rights, religion. Even though we didn't establish a national church, we preserved state churches. There's no attempt at injecting secularism and atheism into the public sphere, and so on. The resistance, if it could preserve these redeemable elements of existing civilization, then for him that was certainly fair game. And so, in his judgment, the revolutionaries simply were not engaging in this process of selection and modification and judgment. And for him, that would completely undermine any possible positive effects that could emerge from either constraining the absolute monarchy of France, imposing greater laws, elevating the parlements. Which for him, he didn't. I don't think he sufficiently criticized the parlements, the administrative jurisdictions in France, as well. And for him, I mean, mostly, even the worst civilizations, there is something worthy of being preserved in the worst civilizations. Think about the worst atrocities of the worst rulers. That did not, there's still some element of history that you could look to from the past to say, look, this is an important principle that is worthy of being preserved, worthy of being revived. Which is why, also, again, back to the conversation about Burke and morals, it's difficult to untangle Burke from any sort of moral philosophy, because you have to make a moral judgment, right, about distinguishing between good and bad precedents. And for Burke, he consistently does that throughout the reflection of the Revolution in France. Due process rights, common law, those are good moral principles. They weren't established by a single legislator, but over time they have proven to be very helpful in securing property rights and preserving social order throughout the generations, preserving the nobility and so on, which allows political stability in Parliament. And that's why also Burke does not, I think, offer a 3-point plan on what's a good and what's a bad precedent.
Right.
But today, if he were writing books, he would not. I suspect he would not be writing books. Sometimes you see political books with the titles, the 5-point plan to get America back on track. The 3 ways conservatives or liberals can restore America. For him, it was a little more complex than those classifications.
I've often suspected that is more the fault of the publicist
Yes.
than the author, but they always want to get that and what you can do about it in the subtitle.
Yeah.
In closing, and I certainly want to encourage the listener to purchase and to read your book, Commerce and Manners in Edmund Burke's Political Economy. Of course, I'll link to that in the show notes. But I wanted to ask you in closing. Yes, hold it up for the camera there. I wanted to ask you in closing, and this simply may not exist, but if you're aware of it, I would be indebted to you. For the listener who's been barely hanging on this entire conversation, and is just like, look, I just need some entry point. I just need something that explains in layman terms what Burke was all about and faithfully translates his ideas. What resource or book would you point them to? Is there any introductory work you're aware of that you could hand somebody that doesn't feel like they have to be already introduced in some manner?
Yes, I actually just reviewed a book written by Ross Carroll called Edmund Burke. It's a nice, tidy volume under 200 pages that offers an introduction to his thought. And because a lot of books, including my book, I Stand Culprit, are long and over 200 pages. But that's the most recent introduction. I'm trying to think of Yuval Levin's book, The Great Debate, on describing the differences between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, the origins of liberalism and conservatism. That's also a good place to start. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. I mean, F.P. Locke has a 2-volume series on Burke, so it's long. I still think the language is pretty accessible. If there's a layman who wants to start on Burke, but has some time on his or her hands and wants to eventually get deep into the weeds, F.P. Locke's 2 volumes I found to be pretty helpful. And then one more off the top of my head. It's probably the shortest volume on Burke I've read. C.B. McPherson, so a Marxist political theorist, but he wrote a short volume. I think it was called Edmund Burke. I would start there and then move your way up there towards the more complex subject-specific dimensions of Burke's thought.
Well, I appreciate it because I know he is a daunting figure to jump into. So any launching off paths we can give people, I would like to try. Greg, thank you for spending some time with us to talk about these interesting, complicated topics. I definitely enjoyed it, and thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Great, thank you for the invitation. I had a great conversation, and I very much appreciate the opportunity discuss these ideas.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.